Coles, who's an academic neurologist in Cambridge and also a practicing consultant in neuroscience. We work with multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease and so on. He's also ordained minister in the Church of England and is a chaplain to the University of Alnbrook's Hospital. And you're going to talk to us on mind, brain and the search of God. And I did a bit of a taster warm-up, but I didn't stray into neuroscience at all.
Great. Okay, so it's a pleasure to be with you. Unlike many of the speakers you've had before you, I'm more one of you than one of them, as it were. So just 8 years ago, I was on the ERMC, which you probably have never heard of. That's the proper course of ministry training in this area, with people who are doing honest day jobs as opposed to you lot who swimming around. So that's what I did, and I did that as my day job as a doctor, as a neurologist, and I did a curacy in a kind of proper Anglican church of the curacy, and now I've strayed from the narrow path and I'm in the kind of chaplaincy world. What I want to do today is, in this first bit of the afternoon, I'm afraid, it's not great timing because it's after lunch, so I'm going to kind of deliver a whole lot of content over 45 minutes, okay, with not much pause for breath. And I apologise for that, but then we can have a discussion. If that's not your style, if you don't like that style, then please kind of go with it, because after tea we'll have a much more interactive and broken up sort of session. So hopefully by the end of the afternoon most people have had some sort of encounter with something that's helpful. Okay, so Henry's asked me to talk about this subject which I've not actually talked about before, and essentially this is one of the hardest philosophical problems that one is ever asked to address: the nature and relationship of the body and the mind and the soul and God. What are those things? And I'm not a philosopher, and I cannot give you a competent overview of that as a philosophical survey. Rather, what I thought I'd do is just give you my personal history in thinking about the soul and its relationship to the body. And if you're already thinking that this might be boring and irrelevant, then let me just make one important pastoral point, which is the minute you do a funeral, your first funeral, you will have to ask yourself, and you may well be asked, where is my mother? Where is my husband? And you will need to have a view, at least in your own head, about quite what's happened to that person and their soul. So I think there is some real pastoral work to be done around this, if only so you have a working answer for the where is the question that appears as you do your funeral visits. So that hopefully will keep you going. So this is how I started, and I wonder if any of you are with me at this stage. So I was, like Plato, a believer in the body being made of stuff that dies, and my soul and my mind being made of stuff that is not material and that is eternal, that just lives on. And understanding God was very easy, because God was sort of made of a similar stuff to this. So me communicating with God, my soul talking to God, was very straightforward. It was the same sort of stuff. The problem in this dualistic approach is understanding how the soul and the mind can talk to the body and vice versa. Or to put it more acutely, what of the mind is in the brain and what is not. That's the problem. So does anyone, would anyone kind of own up to this being their position, roughly speaking? Yep. So is that a little timid yes? Yeah, thank you. Thank you, sister. This is, I would argue, I would speculate, the majority position with the average punter in the street. So if you're not signed up to this, at least understand that this is how people on the whole, will be thinking of their mind and their soul and their God in their body as you talk to them about faith. Now, I do not hold this position anymore. Sounds like many of you don't either. But I just want to take you on a little journey that I've taken. Firstly, I have entered the world, or a few years ago, entered the world of neurosciences, where essentially the position is this, that the body and the mind are one and the same. The mind is a product of the brain. Everything is material. There is no immaterial substance to humans, and that is that. And there is no room for God in that account. Now, I want to make a wordy point at this stage, which you may think is a bit pedantic, but is going to become important way at the end of the afternoon. So my colleagues are all reductionists, and I'm a reductionist. That is to say, we try and take complex things and explain them on the basis of smaller, lower level things. But there are two important types of reductionists. So if you're a scientist, then you will inevitably be a methodological reductionist. Sorry, that is if you're an experimenter at this. If you do experiments, then you will reduce something complex to something quite simple. So I may be a scientist studying climate change, but I may end up only ever measuring the temperature on the Faroe Islands. I'm not trying to encompass all of climate change. I'm trying to reduce it to something that I can measure. So that's methodological reduction, which is different from ontological reductionism, which is the hard reductionist who would say, I believe there is only atoms in this world. Only atoms count. Everything else is a chimera, is a shadow of the way that atoms are put together, and that is the truth. I'm not saying that to make an experiment either, I'm saying that because that is the truth, as I believe it. So we'll come back to that. So, neither of these explanations, the dualist or the reductive monist approach, in my view, is very satisfactory, but the latter is certainly very tempting. So I just want to make a few illustrations to show just how powerful the brain is in creating extraordinary experiences. So this is the cartoon that someone drew of their experience of sitting in a chair and at the same time seeing themselves float up in another chair and look back down on themselves as an identical person sitting in a chair. And about half an hour later, they had the experience of leaving the chair, floating up to the ceiling, and then leaving the chair halfway in midair and going backwards and forwards further up towards the ceiling. How common an experience would you say this was? Frighteningly rare, very common, sort of medium? Any guesses? Medium? Mm-hmm. Medium. Very good. In what disease? Which some of you have. So this is migraine. The commonest cause of extraordinary experiences in otherwise healthy people. So this is the experience of autoscopy or orthoscopy in migraine. And actually it's a much more common form of out-of-body experience than near death, out of which there's been a lot of interest. So an ordinary brain having an ordinary event can do extraordinary things. If we give people drugs, they can have extraordinary experiences. And I particularly want to bring this to your attention. This is a duplication of the Good Friday experiment. Anyone remember this? Okay. So this is an experiment to try and find out what's special about magic mushrooms. And this is a trial of 36 students who weren't particularly unusual, other than that they were American, and half of them had a daily religious experience, which was normal for that part of Texas. And they were given either magic mushrooms, or at least the active component of magic mushrooms, or they were given an amphetamine derivative. Okay? And the purpose of this experiment initially was to see whether magic mushrooms induce a spiritual experience. Okay? So here we go. It's a crossover design. Let's not bother too much about that. But essentially the black is people getting the magic mushrooms here. And if you just look at this first score here, you can see that if you have magic mushrooms, you have an experience that is more spiritual than if you have amphetamine speed. Is that of any interest to you? Yeah? I'm hoping some of you say no, not really. Yeah? Because after all, drugs are going to have all sorts of effects. To me, that's not terribly interesting. It's quite interesting, but not terribly interesting. Here is the most extraordinary result. This is actually 17 years later. Right? So these are students who've grown up, got on with life, and they're now in some, in some professional, or they've dropped out, or they've become pastors, or whatever. Several of them did become pastors. And they were asked, if you remember that experiment where you took the magic mushrooms, how important was it to you? And I'll just remind you that this was an experiment. There was no question of trying to hide the fact that this was an experiment to these people. Now, 10% said this was the single most important lifetime experience I've ever had. The majority said this was amongst the top 5 experiences I've ever had. So as a top tip for your preaching, if you slip magic mushrooms into the wine, people come and say, and 17 years will say, that was the most extraordinary sermon I've ever heard. It's transformed my life. The point I'm trying to make here is that a very ordinary biological event, a drug acting on the brain, not only has immediate effects, not terribly exciting, but can have long-lasting, meaningful impact on people's lives. So something that seems very inauthentic as a spiritual experience has these fruits of the Spirit. Let's move on. Here is quite a famous case history now. I don't know if any of you have come across this. This is the story of a 40-year-old man who's normal and has an interest in pornography. I'll put it like that. An interest in pornography back to his adolescence, but who suddenly became interested in child pornography, which he'd not done before. He became attracted to children, got lots of magazines, inappropriate internet sites, started to solicit prostitutes. He tried to restrain himself but found he couldn't. The pleasure principle overrode his urge restraint. He started to make sexual advances to his stepdaughter, his prepubescent stepdaughter, and only when her stepdaughter told the wife did this all come out, and he was found guilty of child molestation. Evil? Evil man? Surely someone will say this is evil. I mean, do. Yes, Mark, please. We recognise the reality of evil, do we not? So the point of this case history is that that's his brain scan when he was thrown into jail for failing to comply with his rehabilitation. He complained of headache and eventually was discovered to have this brain tumour, which was taken out. He subsequently participated successfully in a Sexaholics Anonymous program, which is a new thing to me, I have to say. And 7 years later, he was better, and he was back at home. In October 2001, he developed a persistent headache. He began collecting pornography again, and his brain tumour had recurred. I'm hoping one or two of you will pick this up in discussion later. The legal position, after discussion, was that this man was not able to control tendencies which had been induced by a brain tumour. He was not responsible for them. And so he was not dealt with as a criminal subsequently, but as a patient. And of course, as one of my colleagues put it, we all have brain tumours, in the sense that we all have small potential pathologies of our brain. We're all put together slightly differently. So if we acknowledge the causative power of this brain tumour in paedophilia, do we not then have to acknowledge the determinism of every aspect of our brain and where it's put together? We all have brain tumours. So this is the world in which I live, and so my division between the body and the soul, as you'll see, is being attacked regularly in my working life, and so that I really couldn't sustain. This has actually been the most provocative thing for me that continues to challenge me. And this is a story which I'll just touch on because I can get very boring about it. This is people who have epilepsy affecting a particular part of the brain, the temporal lobe. Epilepsy is only significant here because what it does is it stimulates the brain. Most other things that we see in people are as a result of brain damage. But in epilepsy you get specific stimulation of part of the brain, and so you can see what that bit of the brain does, if you like. And the person who writes about this most eloquently is Dostoevsky, who had epileptic seizures originating from that part of the brain. And he writes, "You have no idea what joy that joy is which we epileptics experience the second before a seizure, as the temporal lobe is discharged." And so Dostoevsky experiences for a few seconds the consequences of stimulation of one part of his brain. It gives him extreme joy. I don't know whether this lasts for seconds or hours or months, but believe me, I would not exchange it for all the delights of this world. And indeed, many people who have this type of epilepsy do not want to be treated for it. It is so powerfully pleasant, joyful, numinous, and mystical. That is to say, some people describe the experience in ways and words that are very similar to the sort of authentic spiritual experiences that you will be talking to members of your congregation about. Feeling at one with surroundings, feeling somehow within a universal context, feeling that there is a benevolent God who is looking after them. Those sort of feelings can be induced by stimulating just one part of the brain. So if that's the case, are all spiritual experiences nothing but seizures of that part of the brain? Perhaps we are all epileptics. This gets even harder with characters like Sam Harris and Patrick Haggard, and this may be where you would have touched on things, Hilary, is these hard reductionists who say things like this. All of our behaviour can be traced to biological events. We feel we choose, but we don't. You may have thought you decided whether to have tea or coffee this morning, for example, but the decision may have been made long before you were aware of it. And the experiment that comes up time and time again when these statements are made is the Libet experiment, which you mentioned, I think, Hilary. And perhaps I should have, if I'd known that, I would have brought the original experiment. But I have a variant of it, a modern variant of it, which is the Haynes experiment. And I just want to talk you through this. In fact, I need a willing volunteer. You say that willing. Right, so you're lying in a scanner, okay? And you're shown, you can see these letters, one after the other. Ignore that one. These have just one letter on them. And there's 2 seconds, which is quite fast, isn't it? K, T, D, Q, B, da, 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 da. Okay? And your job is simply to decide when to move your arm and which arm to move. Okay? And you can do it whenever you like. So we'll start the experiment. Right? So you decide when to move it and which arm to move it. And when you decide which arm to move it, I want you to move it. Okay? Now the only other thing is, I want you to remember what the letter was when you decided to move your arm. So it goes, look at the letters, decide to move, then move the arm. Right? Now, I'm not going to show you these. I'm going to talk through them. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. Okay. When was it you decided to? G. G. Okay. And he moved it on H roughly?
Yeah.
Do you agree? So there was a delay. I mean, that's not a big surprise. There's a delay between him thinking he moves the right arm and him actually moving it. Okay. That's it. That's it. Except that he was actually scanned during this, my friend. Your name is? John. Right. Here's John's brain. And this is the unsurprising result. So this is looking at the part of the brain that controls movements of the arm, specifically. So this is the right motor cortex, which moves which arm, John? No. Left. Okay? And the red line is when you said the letter G. So this is the time at which you decided to move. And this is the electrical activity in the part of the brain that controls your left arm. Because you moved your right arm, didn't you? So it'd be the left motor cortex. The red line is when you decided, you said G, and here's H. So in the part of the brain that moves your right arm, the electrical activity follows your decision to move the right arm. Bit surprised? Surprised by that?
Depends if there's a different part of the brain that does decision process.
We'll come on to that. You're absolutely right. This is a very simple part of the brain. It literally is the neurons that go to move your arm. Very literally. So would you agree it's not a big surprise that the neurons that move your arm get excited after the point that you make the decision? And you've made the correct observation, which is there must be some other bit somewhere that's making the decision. Yeah. So let's look at that. Now, this box here reminds me that there's an awful lot of jiggery-pokery in this analysis. But let's ignore that. But there's probably some mischief making in the jiggery-pokery. But let's not get too bogged in that. So John, sticking with you, we now ask the question, well, here's the decision time. Let's look at the brain and let's see if there's anything that lights up before you made the decision. So we've got it there, but I'm not letting you see it. All right? So you may have spotted it. How soon, before you made the decision, can we find a bit of the brain active that is responsible for the decision? How soon? Would you guess? So, microseconds, seconds, minutes, hours?
Less than a second.
Less than a second.
Not microsecond.
Not microsecond.
Half a second.
Half a second? Any advance on half a second? 2 seconds before you make a decision to move the arm? Sir? Should I wake you up? You're looking at it dormant.
That's my natural state.
Yeah.
In that sort of experiment, we were told right at the start, this is what you're going to do, is one simple task. I imagine it'd be quite early, which I wouldn't expect in day-to-day life, which is more kind of
Yeah.
changing all that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Obviously, you're pretty good when you're dormant.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So the result of this experiment is that at 8 to 9 seconds before John moved his arm, there was detectable activity, not only suggesting he'd made a decision, but also which side he would go, whether it was left or right. That was the clever thing about this jiggery-pokery. So Mr. Haynes says, whatever you do, madam, whatever you do, 8 seconds before it, you've decided what we're going to do. At least your brain has. Your conscious self catches up about 5 or 6 seconds later. So actually, your brain is in charge of you, and your conscious self is just looking, watching after the event what's happening. You're nothing but your brain. That's what Mr. Haggard said. Sad. Sad. That's interesting. Sad. Do you find that a satisfactory explanation for things?
No, not really.
Do you think? Yeah, I'll come to it. Do you think it can be true that 8 seconds before everything you do, your brain's already decided to do it?
It's possible.
Possible. I'm going to prove to you in a minute that it's not possible. Sir at the back.
Yeah, I was just thinking about responsibility for actions.
Yes.
And someone's put in jail because they've done something.
Yes.
But if their brain has already
Yes.
got to that point,
Thank you.
were they responsible?
Thank you. I mean, this is the hard end of this question. Let's leave this for discussion because it's a critical point. Because this is where this work is going. It's ending up by saying you are not responsible. It wasn't you. It was your neurons that made you do it. Okay, I'm going to suppress questions for him because I've been told I have to follow a set format by Hillary. So here's some more words. So this is bottom-up reductionism. So the hard reductionist, Mr. Haynes, would say that when I came here, the first event actually in reality was a molecular event, an activation of a particular receptor which caused a particular electrical change in my hippocampus, which is a part of the brain, which is responsible for spatial navigation, and I found St Edmund College. And that ultimately is what humans are. The end product of molecular events, or even atomic events. And that any imagination that we have, that we're in control, or that consciously experiencing things, is an epiphenomenon. It's a side effect. Okay. I have two important proofs that is not correct. This one is about musical training, and there's loads of papers that will say the same sort of thing as this. The most famous is taxi drivers, but people have heard me talk, are really irritated by me going on about taxi drivers. So here's what I think is a really nice subtle variant. This is looking at professional musicians who practice a lot. So most of them are practicing 2 or 3 or 3 or 4 hours a day. And teachers of music, who presumably are similar sorts of people, roughly speaking, but they have other things to do, and so they're only practicing 1 or 2 hours a day mostly. Some of them are managing 4, which is impressive. And the experimenter says, well, can we see a difference in the brains of people who are doing the same thing, roughly, and the same sort of people, but one of them is doing it for a few hours more a day than the other. That's quite a nice experiment, isn't it? Because you can control for quite a lot of things there. And so you do the scans, and there are some significant differences. And these are, in red, those areas which are bigger. The brains are actually larger in professional musicians than in music teachers. The way of showing this here isn't very helpful, I think, in getting over the point that this is not about brain scans being active or not active. This is about parts of the brain actually being bigger, like a muscle that is bigger through over years.
Did they scan the brains at a sort of 0 point and then show the change, or no, they couldn't have gone back?
No, this is comparing at this point. So Claire's picked up the possibility that these people started off life with bigger parts of the brain, and that's why they've become professional musicians. That, I guess, is possible. The taxi driver experiment would say that's not true. So,
Was that correlation more true along the lines of being professional musicians versus music teachers, or along the amount spent per day?
I can nearly answer that with this chart here, which is nearly that. It's not so much how many hours, this is how quickly you can tap your fingers with your left hand, which is being used as a surrogate here for how good a piano player you are, or how rapid a piano player. And this is, yes, okay. Well, this is methodological reductionism. And this is the volume of an area in the brain, this bit here. And the scientists, the experimenters are claiming, and you can tackle this if you like, that there's a correlation, not quite of what you said, but between the size of this area and your skill at performing it. And the two musical groups are better than those non-musicians, and the professionals are better, as it were, than the amateurs. Now, you may or may not be swayed by this particular example. I'm quite comfortable if you're not. Let me tell you that there are multiple examples where persistent activity leads to alterations in the brain. I mean, after all, you want that to happen, don't you? Those of us who have children who we send to school, we sort of want their brains to change. Some of us are paying huge amounts of money to achieve that. Okay, so the reason why this is important, I think, is because it's scientific evidence, not complete, but it's suggestive of top-down processing as well as bottom-up. In other words, that we can choose a behaviour to play the piano 4 hours a day, which has an impact on the structure of our brain and potentially on molecular events. And so there is both bottom-up and top-down processing. This is how I begin to think of it. Now, my evidence number 2, which my friend here didn't come to mind immediately, but should have done, is the example of rapid, sophisticated movements in response to events that are clearly less than 8 seconds before. So, just in case there are a few of you who have dropped in from some other planet, this is Sachin Tendulkar, who's just retired as possibly the greatest batsman ever. And this unpleasant character is Sohaib Akhtar, who's not very good but is very, very fast. And the point is, when Sohaib Akhtar bowls to Sachin, there is only 400 milliseconds in which Sachin has to react. That's the time it takes between Sohaib letting the ball go and Sachin hitting it. Now, you and I would probably die in this situation because we just can't get out of the way quickly enough. Now, Sachin Tendulkar and a few other highly gifted individuals not only don't die, but they can hit the ball most of the time wherever they want. So Sachin is able to hit the ball that this character has bowled, not only to avoid being killed, but to actually direct it in between fielders. And if you don't believe me, just go onto YouTube, he can do that. So he has an extraordinary skill. Now, why has he got that extraordinary skill? What does he do that you don't do?
Practice.
He practices 6 hours a day. Right? Now, none of you do that, I'm pretty sure, go in the cricket game. So he has altered his brain, I speculate, we don't know for sure, as a result of that extraordinary activity. Now, Sachin has a particular character. He has made decisions throughout his life to practice this unusual thing, which has altered his brain, and that has worked downwards in this top-down processing way, but also it works up to define his character, in my view. Yes?
And does he still make the conscious decisions? So
No. Thank you very much for pointing that out. So that is too fast for a conscious decision. Now, he, like most batsmen, will tell you that he sees the ball and wants to play it over there. But it's quite clear that the consciousness of that comes after the event. So what has he done? His training, which is very conscious, isn't it? If you remember the first time you learned to play an instrument or whatever, it's highly conscious. Do you remember this? Can I get some nods of affirmation and empathy? It's torture, moving the fingers and stuff. But after a while, it becomes automatic in some way. Is that right? Now, he's done that to the nth degree. So he has taken a conscious decision which has led to the extraordinary behaviour, which has led to automatic reflexes that you don't have and I don't have. Do you see what I'm... Now, what I think that's very helpful for in considering a life in faith is, this is my perspective, you're willing to, please come back at me. But I think it is a good thing to focus on my behaviours, what I spend my time doing, because I think that will influence my brain structure and will make things automatic that are potentially virtuous. I could spend all my time looking at pornography on the internet. I could do, and lots of us do. And that will impact on our brains. And that will lead to automatons that are not virtuous. That's how I look at this. So we are all Sachin Tendulkars of something or other. I mean, you have just as bizarre a lifestyle as Sachin Tendulkar has, because you are choosing to study for ordination, which is a very minority pursuit, isn't it? And so you are engaging in a whole set of behaviours and interactions which are leading to alterations in your brain, which will impact because you're developing automatic responses which will play out later in life in your congregational life, which may be good or bad, but they are the consequence of past choices, past deliberation. Okay. So I love this. And I come to this passage of scripture absolutely with this picture of bottom-up and top-down reduction. Because in this writing of Paul, I feel the same sense of turmoil, of very biological urges within me, and appetites, which may be good or bad, and a tussle with my conscious self to channel those appropriately, restrain them, or allow them to flourish. Now, the only bit of this that I don't like is the sense that it's the body that is sinful. And this is where Paul and I are going to diverge. And I just want you to watch as you think about your own theological approach to this, that you don't end up with the Platonic position, as it were, that the body is a cage that is just about making you a victim of appetites, and your soul is perfect and rational and free and pure. Because that's not the picture. But this tussling experience, I think, is a very familiar one. Is it familiar? Can I get nods of empathy? There are a few saints here today. It's interesting. Okay, so here's where I've come to. So I'm a non-reductionist physicalist. There are not many of us. I think you had Warren Brown as one of your things, so I'm a disciple of Warren Brown. So I think my body makes up my mind and my soul. Not absolutely completely, as you'll see in a minute, but all of that is material. It is nothing but matter and stuff. So when I die, that all goes. Okay? So I preached in church the other day. When you die, that's it. You're dead. There is nothing left over. So I'm trying to preach what I believe, which is a challenge. That's it. It's all over. My soul's gone, my mind's gone. There is nothing material left. And that is all dependent on matter, so it's gone. What's good about this model is that it incorporates a lot of the sort of experimental work I've shown you. It ties in with the whole embodied cognition psychology theme, which is really exciting and new and stuff like that. The problem is that we have an immaterial God, and we now have to account for how this immaterial God interacts with my material soul. And I'll offer you one solution to that, which is completely inadequate. But I just want to highlight the importance of emergence as an issue for me, and I'm going to describe what I mean by that. And that's why these aren't completely overlapped. But how does an immaterial God act with the material? Well, this is a kind of long-term problem that philosophers have dealt with. One solution which has been offered, which I really like because of the story, is you'll know Karl Popper as a philosopher of science. And John Eccles is one of our great neurophysiologists, got the Nobel Prize. And these two were invited by the Pope to wander around the Vatican garden one summer and solve the problem of how the immaterial God acts in the material world, in the brain. And they came up with this hypothesis, which is that if you look at the vesicles, this is the nerve terminal. This is one nerve abutting another, and messages get from one side to the other by the secretion of chemicals, and these chemicals are stored in little packages called vesicles. And what these two worked out is that these vesicles are so small and so close to the surface membrane that if you apply Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, which is to say you can't know how fast something is and where it is, or you can't know where something is and how fast it is, there's just this little wobble room for quite where something is. That it could be that God could move one of these vesicles across the membrane without disturbing any physical laws and lead to neurotransmitters secreted here and a signal in this nerve. And that would lead to this whole cascade of events. And I just love the idea of these two wandering around, mulling it through and thinking about this. Peter Clark, who you've already heard of, has done the calculations, and that turns out to be completely wrong, which is a shame. But this is the sort of attempt you'll see. I think fundamentally this is going to be a hard problem forever. Anyway, this is my final little section, and although this may seem a bit trite, is that me or is that someone else speaking? Right. I hope you'll bear with me, because I've used this in church as an illustration. You may find this helpful to take away, you may not. As I try to get across my idea of how I can be fully material, a brain and a soul made up of matter, and that to be a real thing with integrity. So this is a chair, and my question to you is, how can we satisfactorily explain this chair? So if I just pick at random, perhaps this lady over here is interested in kind of ergonomics, and she says, well, I think a chair is this. You define it by its function. You're a functional sort of character, is that right?
Yep.
You're happy with that. Okay. Now this lady here, she's interested in what it's made of. So this chair for her, it doesn't really matter that it's a chair or a table, but for her, it's really important, isn't it, that it's made of this type of wood.
Yeah.
That really gets you going. Whereas you, sir, are a bit of a microscopist, and you've microscoped this wood, and you see that, and you think, well, actually, for me, that's the most important explanation of the structure of this chair. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Isn't that stunning?
Yeah.
Have you ever seen wood under a microscope?
No, I haven't actually.
It's great, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, madam, you're a bit of a nerd, and for you, this is the big thing. You're not worried about the wood or the structure, it's the chemical composition. What really gets you going is just how much hemicellulose there is in this chair. Yeah? That's really...
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
She is a chemist.
She's a chemist. There you go. So my question then is, well, what is the most satisfactory explanation for this chair? Who's right between the four of them? they're all right. And of course, depending on quite what you want to do, one is better than the other, isn't it? I mean, if I say my chair's broken, I desperately need a chair for my meetings tonight, we want this lady who knows about the function of chairs, who probably has a collection of chairs, who can bring one along that will serve the same function for what I need. Whereas if I say my chair's broken and I need it repaired exactly the same, I want this woody person who's going to find the right woody type stuff, and so on. Do you see the point? Now, they're all material, but different levels of explanation allow for different characteristics to emerge. So, at the chemical level, you couldn't really say easily that this composition would lead to a structure that looks like that, which then would lead to a structure that looks like that, which then would lead to a function. You take the point that this slab of wood could be a table, could be a desk, could be a chopping board. You need new things to be introduced to make it into a chair. So from this comes the idea of emergence, that as you go through different levels of structure, new characteristics emerge that are not easily explained by those below. So, this is my chair. And this chair was given to me by my mother-in-law. It was made by her father, Major Jack, who was killed when she was 5. So she doesn't know her father. She doesn't know him other than this photo of Major Jack before he went out to Japan. So for me, the most satisfactory explanation of this chair is none of the things that we've mentioned. It's actually a story. And it's a story that depends on a history and relationships. But it's still a chair. Nothing has changed about its substance. Do you see? It's still made of wood. Nothing new has been added to its material composition. And I think of the brain and my soul very like this. So there's nothing in this little story here that adds anything spooky or immaterial, in my view. This chair is still made of matter, and this story wouldn't have happened in this way without that chair. You need that chair and its wood and its hemicellulose and all the rest of it for this story to work. Just like I, to be human, need my brain. And if I don't have my brain, if you don't have this chair, the story just crumbles. There is nothing to it, this particular story. But to say that there's nothing to this chair but its chemical composition is to miss out on Major Jack and my mum-in-law. Do you see that? And so, for me, my soul is a real thing. It is a collection of my personal history, my relationships, perhaps my relationship with God in some way, embodied and embedded in my brain and in the other bits of me. And when I die, that will be that. Gone. My soul will go as an expire, because it's highly dependent on my brain to exist, just like this story will go in some way when this chair goes. Now you're already seeing where I'm going with this. Now, I don't have time or the confidence actually to talk about the, and this is where I'm hoping to get some feedback, on the biblical basis for understanding matter and the soul. But as I reread the scriptures now, I'm struck by how little dualism there is there. How little. So just in case your education was like mine as a Christian, and you were told that the Bible tells you that there's a material body and an immaterial soul, let me tell you that isn't true. That is not a consistent theme of Scripture. It certainly is there in part of it. But I now warm, as you might imagine, to the New Testament picture of us dying and being thoroughly dead until the trumpet sound and we are given a resurrected body, and only then In my view, Scripture doesn't say this. Only then do we have a soul that lives and breathes. Now the problem for me and that position is the continuity question. So when I've died and I'm properly dead, what is there that is continuous, that allows me to re-emerge in my resurrected body? That is the problem. Whereas if you believe in eternal souls, then you don't have that problem to face. And this is where I think you need to get your heads around what you're going to say to your funeral families. But I say, and I mean it, and I apologise if this sounds a bit wet, but I say the continuity, just like my chair, if that was broken, if it ceased to be a chair, the continuity I have when I die will be in the memories of those around me and ultimately in the memory of God. And that's it. So, that is my summary. Many Christians are implicit dualists. Neuroscientists just don't accept that. So if you want to talk to people like me, you need to change your language. Monist accounts tend to be reductionist and exclude God, both ontological reductionism and methodological reductionism. Whereas my position, which is a non-reductive physicalist position with emergence, I think leaves space for God. But most of our behaviour is immediately determined by our biology, but our behaviour and our choices can alter brain structure and our biology. So there is a dynamic interaction between brain and mind.
Sure. Well, one question we have, so if there's this discontinuity somehow after our physical death to the resurrection bodies or something, do we exist in actuality during that hiatus period, or is it just a potentiality of ourselves that will kind of be recreated in some sense at some point by God, in God?
Well, as usual from you, that's a very clever question, which I have a good answer to, which I'm just not going to tell you. I honestly don't know. And the way I think about this is in a very humdrum way of this memory business. So if that chair were to disappear tomorrow from my home, it would still have a big impact in my life because it summarises for me a whole chain of relationships. And so it still exists in some sense, and I would say the most important sense, because actually I can get another chair to hold me up. So that's the way I imagine I will continue to exist after my death, that God will have an accurate and clear memory of the important bits of me.
So the problem is a chair doesn't act and the chair doesn't have sentience, whereas we do.
Yes.
And so during that interim, can we act? Can we be aware of goings on here or in heaven? Can we be worshipping during that?
Well, I imagine no. That's what I imagine. And I mean, Paul does make a distinction, doesn't he, between those of us who are alive at the time of the second coming and the new resurrection, and those who are dead. So we are different in some way. And to me, that difference may be that those who are dead are asleep, silent, are not worshipping, and then will be woken up.
Okay, so you don't advocate praying to the saints then, for example?
No, I don't. I don't. I do pray for the example of the saints, which I think is a powerful tool for us still. But it doesn't mean anything to me to pray to those who are dead. Yeah. That's absolutely correct.
We had a question about the non-reductive physicalism model where you had the kind of overlapping.
Yes.
Could you bring that back up?
Uh-oh. I worry about how sustained this model is going to be. Then.
There you go. So we were wondering, of the overlapping bodies,
Yes.
soul minds,
Yes.
what is in the kind of non-overlapping bit on the soul mind bit?
Yes. So thank you for that. I mean, so the non-overlapping body bits are things like my toes and my kidneys, which don't have a big impact on my soul, other than that if they didn't work, then I wouldn't be effective at getting around to them. The bit that is not overlapping with my body is this history thing and community thing. So in the chair example, it's Major Jack, and it's the mother-in-law and her relationship with me. So you can look in my brain as hard as you like, and you will not find an account of my relationship with my wife and my children. You won't find an account of that. But that's very much part of my soul. But it can only exist with my brain function.
So in the middle is how those things have changed your brain structure.
Yes. That's right.
Is it possible, though, that your history and your experiences have actually shaped your brain and are, to some extent, in your brain?
Yes,
so
of
you
course.
can't pull it out like ice from a filing cabinet, so in a sense it is there.
Yes, and that's that kind of dynamic interaction. Yes. You won't find in my brain an account of the name of my wife and her date of birth and so on and so on and so on. You will find an account of the effect of my brain of a loving relationship from a particular time. That's the distinction of it. Presumably someone else could have had, with a different name and a different date of birth, could have had a similar effect. See what I mean?
Yeah.
But there is a dynamic interaction, and that's the point I'm trying to get across, that I'm changed by those things.
I don't understand what was to get out of that's not in the body. Is that other people's minds and other people's
So community would be part of it, and the history of my education and so on. So part of that is embedded in my brain structure, in the way that I've described, the Sachin Tendulkar way, and part of it never impacts on that.
Is it material?
So is history something? Is it stuff? Are relationships stuff? But do they depend on stuff? I mean, we'll have different views on this, I accept.
It's just the model.
Very limited.
I realise there may be practical problems with this, but if you could transplant a brain
Yes.
into a different body,
Yes.
would you create a new person?
So it's a great question. It's a question that's been asked a lot. And if you're coming, different people will have different views on this. So Descartes would say you're the same person because the soul is ingrained in your brain and it determines who you are. I would say, no, you're a different person. So your body is different and your body does have impact on who you are. So whether you have kidney disease, your liver's working right, those are things about your person. But also you're in a different place and time with different network of relationships. I think the brain's quite a simple thing in some ways. It's a processing unit which can be taken to different environments and you get different outputs. Anyone over here completely sorted in this group? What were you chatting about?
We got in a bit of a pickle about free will.
Yes.
Big
Yeah.
pickle,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think that's, that is one of the hard places for this, isn't it? And I think it's a really important pastoral issue. So when you're dealing with someone in a few years' time who is compulsively doing, internet pornography, to what extent do they have power to get over that? I think that's a really, hard pastoral question. And do you have a view? Did you come to a view?
No, I mean, we got a bit more pickled because we were thinking about if all of our decisions are just a result of our cultural, historical, community
Yes.
makeup, which is
Yes.
still part of us,
Yes.
but actually it takes the sense of decision away.
Yes.
So all you've got is
Yes.
stuff that was always going to happen, an
Yes,
accident.
absolutely. Yes.
We got, we didn't really conclude.
Yeah, so that's a kind of deterministic view, and there's biological determinism, but there's a social determinism as well that's equally undermining of free will. Can I just offer you a picture for this internet pornography thing? Can I offer you a picture and see whether you go with it? So if I'm dealing with a man who's into internet pornography, which is a big issue and it's very common, right? I think that man in front of his has no control, and you should not. The question is, what choices has he made habitual, and to allow that to impact on his brain? And there I think you can, in a normal, healthy person, criticise them for their choices over weeks and months. And as a consequence of that, which may be completely determined. So where that goes pastorally, I think, is you say, well, what has happened that leads you to do this? Let's not worry about why you're doing this now in front of your laptop. Let's say, what are the choices that have led to this being in somehow an acceptable activity? Do you see the difference there?
Yeah, definitely.
I think that can defuse the situation, and also you're recognising the impulsiveness and the compulsion about that particular behaviour. So,
but then how do you go on to help them change those patterns?
yes. So I'm not a therapist,
Yeah.
you know, and I don't have those skills.
Yeah.
So I'm just, and in the situations where I've been in, I'm not sure I always have helped, other than to say, let's look at the broader picture and to see. And on a couple of occasions, we came to the conclusion that this behaviour was actually was a temporary avoidance of some large issue that was just too painful to deal with. And actually it was a kind of relief-giving situation. And just to rephrase that behaviour in those terms was helpful to the person. I'm not a therapist in this zone. It's just an area where I've encountered lots of concern.
A separate question. The cricketer or the musician who becomes better with practice,
Yes.
can we do anything if we try for long enough?
Yes.
Where does natural gifting kind of come in, and is there a limit to how good one can get?
So you know the answer to that question.
I think so. But
What is the answer to that question?
That yes, if we try for long enough, we can develop that particular part of the brain
That's wrong.
that would grow. That's wrong.
So I mean, do you think you could ever back like Sachin Tendulkar?
If I had years and years and I was
Do you think
incredibly
you
fit,
could?
potentially. If
Okay.
it might take me a lot longer because I
Okay.
don't have
Do you
the
think you
natural
could run the
sense.
100 metres in 9.5 seconds?
If you put me out on the track now,
No,
then
no. If you had all the
but
time
if
in
I
the
had all
world.
the time in the world, that depends on the physical as well as the. Yes. Okay. Yeah. No, I'm there.
If you put him on the track when he was 9 years old,
Do you think he could?
I don't know.
Do you think he could be the world's greatest weightlifter, and the world's fastest bowler, and the world's best batsman?
It's a mixture of psychological and physical factors. There's supposed to be 6 on like a top class footballer. They're a mixture of psychological and physical.
I mean, my picture for this is, and I think again this pastorally is helpful to think about. I think that when we're born, we have a determined range of possibilities that comes from our body's capacity. Now, I'm a slow runner. I've always been a slow runner. There was a time when I trained hard to be a runner. I don't think I could ever have run the 100 metres in 9.5 seconds. I mean, no one ever has. So I don't think that was ever in my range of possibilities. Now, I'm sure I could run faster than I do now, so there's some wobble with me. Where I think this is important is I really protest at the idea that let's embarrass you, you might give your congregation the idea that they could be anything they want to be if they only try hard enough. Because I think that's a route to disappointment, and it's just not true. So there may be people who have limited capacity for virtuous behaviour, who have limited capacity for communal behaviour, limited capacity to be good news in your congregation. I mean, you probably know those people. And so and C.S. Lewis is with me here on this, what we're looking for is not their absolute ability, capacity, but what wobble, what maturation and growth have we seen within the bounds of that. Is that fair? Do you have self-esteem problems or gender identity?
So you talked about the mind of God, and that is presumably an immaterial mind. So what would you say to a suggestion that, thinking again about life after death rather than anything now, it would be possible for God to create an immaterial version of our minds, of our experience and person?
Well, I imagine that he could. It's not very helpful for me to say that. I don't see that in Scripture anywhere. But it's a world I know little about, I'm afraid.
I guess also, from your position as a neurologist, I mean, is there any, do you think there's any meaning that we would be, or anything that we could grasp onto in that respect, or do you think we must sort of stay within the frame of reference that we're in?
So I see where you're coming from. So I think I would say no. I don't think I can be human without a body in any way. I don't think I can have a human mind or a human soul in any way without a body. That'd be my position.
I was thinking of John's Gospel and the theme of life and eternal life that runs through John's Gospel. And that my understanding from that is that eternal life is basically knowing God, and that can start today. So eternal life is not something that starts in the future, it can start today, goes on forever as knowing God. Yeah. If we die and that's it, there's nothing, does my relationship with God, if I'm only in his mind sort of as a potentiality and not actually able to relate, has my relationship gone on pause?
Yeah. Well, I'll say exactly what I think about that, but can I say it humbly? Will you understand that I don't really know the answer to this? But my view would be that when I die and I'm buried, that is it. There is nothing of me that can relate to God until I'm given a resurrected body. The continuity that's in God's mind is only in this model, the template to rebuild me.
So, with another image of Jesus saying, the Spirit will come to you, I in you, you in me, is it just you in me and the I in you is finished for now?
Yeah, I mean, I agree these are themes and texts which make me pause for thought, so please don't think I'm approaching this arrogantly. But the way I understand that is yes, that one half of that relationship stops. I mean, where this really plays out is when people say, I know Mum's up there looking down on me and I want to die and join her. Or I'll soon be with her. Parents of a child who's died will often talk about looking forward to being reunited, those sort of issues. And for me, that reunion is at the time of the second coming, the trumpet sounding, and our resurrected bodies. But please don't think I'm trying to undermine another position.
Yeah.
Alasdair, how much do you think I with you in terms of that, more or less, but how much should we be honest with people when actually what people want to hear is, that my mum's looking down on me or whatever? And
Yes.
Do we have wobble room for actually
So
allowing people to believe their own narrative
exactly.
without trying
So
to...
how helpful is it for me to go into that funeral family and say, well, actually he's dead and gone, and there's nothing left. How
it sounds like a humanist view.
Well,
if I can put it like that in one sense.
It is in one sense. And I come to this reluctantly. I'm not. Now, I don't think that's at all helpful for me to come and say that. If parents want to say, I'm looking forward to being reunited with my children, well, I think they will be. I think that will happen. So I don't kind of stop and say, well, actually, there's this period of time, a millennia, where it's not going to happen.
Does it help to think of someone who's died as being outside of time? I mean, because we do tend to talk about people who died as still being within a temporal framework.
Yeah.
that they're present somehow in
Yeah.
space and time.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know.
Maybe for some people, I mean, that just gets too philosophical for me.
Mm.
Like I don't find that helpful. I mean, I hope in this kind of line of discussion, can we conclude that these apparently theoretical issues do have pastoral impact? They are important. Can we conclude that today, even if we have very divergent views? And I don't think in the counselling immediate bereavement situation we want to go too heavy on this. But don't we want to wake up and be mature preachers to mature Christians? I mean, that's the problem, I think, is not so much that this stuff isn't made overt at the time of a death, but that it isn't preached regularly on a Sunday morning, or at least it hasn't been to me. No one's told me what happens to me when I die. I had to work it out for myself, kind of thing.